to, of course, the Caffeys who made it safely back. We wish them all the best. Welcome to everybody joining us on YouTube. So thrilled to be back as we have our 10:30 study session. Everybody's back in town. We've got wonderful people here. Welcome to Jonathan and Bubba and Steve and Flossie and Jeff and Larry and Sheila and Noel and Michael. We're going to have a great class today, and then we'll go over what we're going to do later. But today, and again, all of the classes are, remember, what you guys choose. So today, what you guys chose was favorite Torah portions. And so I didn't know if other people got theirs, but I got my favorite Torah portions, one from each book of the Torah, to go over that whenever you guys have. But I didn't know if anybody had any favorite Torah portions that they have before I go into mine.
Well, I'll volunteer.
Please, Michael.
And this is kind of cheesy maybe, but Vayera, which has the Akedah, and it's not just for that part of it, but if you read it as a whole, and if you want to take it from a sociological, psychological perspective, it just has a whole bunch of wonderful things about an old woman who wants to have a child, but she's past childbearing age. And meantime, Abraham's other wife has a child, so she's jealous. So you have, and then, eventually kicks him out of the house. And I just think, beyond the Akedah, I think that's just, it's just, the whole thing is just so interesting it's really about in one sense, it's really about a marriage and how people get along or don't get along. And there's a little bit about, vengeance, and a little bit about, you have to have a little bit of compassion at least. So I think that, and of course the Akedah, we could all talk about for days and days and days. And I just think that's a great parsha.
Yeah, but the question that always disturbs me about it is, where was Sarah during all of this? You say it was a question of marriage, but there really was no discussion. I mean, you think of marriage, that they would talk to each other, and he would say, at least there'd be some recognition of him saying, look, I got this vision, I got this message from God that, I'm supposed to take our son and bring him up and sacrifice him. But they don't even say that. There's no message of it there. It just seems like, and there's a lot of commentary recently on, well, how it affected Isaac, when him growing up, what did he think? Was his father going to betray him or kill him, or, so that part of the story, I don't know, it just kind of would not be my favorite.
Okay, but I mean,
I understand the overriding goal was possibly to show, against maybe human sacrifice, but the way it's brought about, if there would have been some discussion of or brought Sarah into the picture at all, it just she just is vanished.
Well, but all you're absolutely right, and the and the psychological impact on Isaac, of course, but you have to look at it, or at least I think you have to look at it in the context of the times, where the women, I don't want to say didn't matter, but their role was less, and their husbands weren't necessarily expected to tell them what they were thinking or what they.
Yeah, but she waited 90 years to have a child or something. I mean, how old was she when she asked the child?
Well, she was 100 actually. 100, she had Isaac, but I mean, I think it's pretty clear that
I just think there's an explanation there that should have been at least tried to develop. I understand, there's probably a lot of editing that took place in the stories and things, but
and it's also, when you bring that up, Abraham and Sarah are never in another story together, and as far as we know, never talk again, because she dies right afterwards. So is this the reason they never talk? What was the relationship between men and women? You read books like The Red Tent, and it makes it seem like the men and women lived completely different lives. And, I think it's probably more dependent on the relationship, like today. Some men and women, when they're married, or men and men or women and women, are always together. And sometimes they only see each other once in a while, but I can only imagine why he would not want to discuss this with his wife, who waited 100 years to have a baby, to say, I'm going to go kill our baby. I would have avoided that discussion as well, probably, quite frankly. So that's a good one. So that is an important one. Does anybody else have another one they'd like to mention? Noel.
Well, this has always been my favorite, I guess, because I'm a social activist, about when you reap the harvest of your field. Don't reap the whatever the schmutz is that falls down, the oats and all of that, the gleanings. Leave it for the poor. And that has always stuck with me, about we need to take care of the poor, always. And that's what I try. Because we don't have gardens or fields or whatever. So I take it that it was meant we must help the poor. And that's what I do.
One. And again, that's from Leviticus, from the portion and more, from Leviticus 24. And that's essential because it's one of the bases for our religion, is the need to help those in need. And not only is it it's basically given very strictly as to what you do. So it's not a decision to be made. It's an assumed idea that you're going to leave your feet, what do they call it, fallow, and let the poor who need it. And it's spoken very specifically later, obviously, in the book of Ruth. So right. That's an excellent one. Also, those are really, you got the one that talks about how to help others, and the one about the most difficult story about killing the firstborn. So those are two very different ones. Larry, I think you wanted to add another one.
Yeah, well, I'm always interested in connections of how things kind of connect with each other. And the thing, and obviously the story of the Bible is, even though it's disjoint, in the original narrative, in some of the narrative there, the story of Joseph always kind of grabs me as the one that's got such continuity to it. It's got such a thread that runs through it, even into Exodus, where, it leads to the Exodus from Egypt finally. But the whole story of the betrayal by the brothers, and then even the family dispute, and the the vision did he get a vision from God? Did he see things on his own? And I guess part of my distortion of it is because of the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. I just love that, so I get those two mixed up. I don't know which is the Bible and which is Andrew Lloyd Webber, though they're close, I think, in many respects. And the idea of forgiveness. But the other day, we had, we had read Joseph, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and Rabbi Cantor happened to be here for Temple Osa Shalom, and he made the one comment that I found very interesting that I never realized before, and that is toward the end of one of the Torah portions. I guess Joseph takes place over several Torah portions.
Over
right?
4 Torah portions, yeah. Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, and Vayechi.
Yeah, and the last one, I think there's some indication that now the father is dying, and that the brothers become very nervous over the fact that the father is dying, and that they say, I think the brother Joseph, now that he's still the big wheel, we don't have the father to intervene. And that, they kind of then come to Joseph and they tell Joseph that, the father is supposedly told them that, to keep together, or that Joseph should continue to protect them. But the whole thing, kind of, it kind of demeans the whole idea, I think, of Joseph, because Joseph had forgiven them already. Was his forgiveness insincere, over when he finds out that, with Benjamin, he plants the cup, and then he says, okay, as long as one of the brothers came forward and admitted the guilt, and things like this, I'm forgiving him. So I guess I like the story. I like the connections. It just seems to me that it was portrayed like, did they lie to him? Was there a conversation? It seems like a very natural thing to do for, I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place, for the father to say to the sons, look, I want the whole family to stay together. I remember, and I never knew my grandfather on my father's side, but my father repeated the story several times to me about one of his father's dying wish was that all of the family should always stay together. So it did seem to be a natural thing. Yet sometimes it's portrayed as the brothers had lied to him, that they were fearful of this. So whether or not the brothers did tell him the truth or not, that the father did have this conversation, I don't know. But I like the story. I like the Joseph story.
And we can understand the worry. I mean, it's a natural worry. How is your brother going to treat you when you've treated him poorly once your dad has died? You got your whole family, you're in Egypt, your job is dependent upon this brother. And so even though he's promised it, I could still see the worry, but you're right, it does demean Joseph a little bit because they don't trust him. But I guess the worry would be natural, especially when your family, I mean, you're basically, nepotism is the word of the day, and your job and everything you have is based upon your little brother. And so I can see why that worry would be so.
But the other question I have, Rabbi, maybe you could answer this, is that the land in Israel was divided up now among the tribes, right?
No, not yet. That's much later. That's after.
Okay, but I mean, it gets divided up among the tribes, but the tribe that Joseph and Benjamin, they basically inherit what I consider to be the prime portion, right? They inherit Jerusalem, compared to the other 10 tribes go up north.
Well, eventually the tribe of Ephraim is going to be up north. Benjamin will be around Jerusalem, but will be a very tiny tribe that is really taken over by Judah. So Ephraim, his youngest son, does become probably the second most important tribe after Judah.
Oh, okay.
So
but how is that decided? I mean, it seems again to me that there's preferential treatment of Joseph or Benjamin, the younger sons, which we see, Isaac and Esau and those kind of things.
Well, basically what it means is that once they get into the land, Joseph gets a double portion. Both his son, so the tribe of Joseph gets 2 portions. It's just that they're divided into 2 tribes, and Ephraim becomes a very powerful tribe, and Manasseh.
Who decided on the double portion then for Joseph? I guess why the favoritism for Joseph?
Well, basically, by the time they'd already been divided into 2 tribes, so Manasseh and Benjamin had already been divided at some point into 2 tribes. We don't know originally where exactly, but we do know that there were 2 tribes. So Joseph's name is never on the list. So when does this happen? We don't know, but we do know in the Bible it happens when their father, Jacob, comes before and says, basically, these 2 sons are going to be representative of you. So that's where it happens in Genesis. In Exodus, when they actually go into the land and the land is divided, it is divided with with Manasseh and Ephraim both getting their own areas. But what's important is Manasseh disappears really quickly, and Ephraim is the second most powerful tribe. But the whole idea is Joseph gets a double portion for whatever reason. But it's obvious that he's, the most important of the brothers in Egypt. So that's a good one too. I mean, that's the end of Genesis. Anybody else have one they'd like to add? Well, I will add a couple because I picked one from each book to see. So the first one I picked was from the book of Genesis, and I picked the portion known as Bereshit, which means Genesis. It's the very first portion of the Bible. It's the story of course, the creation of the world, and then, of course, of Adam and Eve. So I picked it because it's the basis for our belief in the world today. It's a very scientific but religious way of looking at the world. God creates the world in this organized fashion. So it begins very broad the universe is created. It's created in organized fashion, which is very different than all the other groups. And then it goes to a particular family, which is not necessarily the first man and woman on earth, but really the first man and woman that their descendants will become Jewish. So Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, but there are people in other places. It's just their line will be the line of Judaism. So it goes from this broad creation of the world and how God created the universe to a very specific group of people where God has a connection with them. So it's really strange that this God would create the universe, which is pretty big if you didn't know. I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty big. And then all of a sudden, God cares about these two individuals and their lineage. It's a very strange and powerful moment in humanity when we see this all-powerful entity who cares about these two people out of the entire cosmos. And it really sets for me the precedent of what we have today, the idea that God cares about the universe and cares about this one little planet, third one around the sun, that has these people on there and cares about us. So it's a really strange but powerful way of beginning this whole Torah, this whole Bible. And
I'll go with that one because I think that's the one I read back in November, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Not November. No, not November.
September.
I think it was
October.
The first one I did.
Yes,
I think that maybe
October.
That was my my second, or I don't know, my lost count, but that was one of my maybe second or first or second.
So it's a really powerful, and then of course we go straight into human weakness, where we see that we have this powerful God who created the cosmos, creates these two individuals and gives them minds and bodies and puts them differently. And then it goes right into all the issues. I mean, it doesn't even pause. Basically, it says you're created. Now let's deal with all the issues you have. And it's very quick, this transition to deal with human, our weaknesses. And so we see it from the very beginning that Adam and Eve have issues and they have to deal with them. Their children have issues, very serious issues that they have to deal with. And yet they remain husband and wife for 900 plus years, despite the fact that they're kicked out of their home, despite the fact that one of their children kills their other one and goes off and is basically forced into exile. And, they do have a third child and they have grandchildren from that one, but it's a really difficult story. And yet it's very human. And even though we don't deal with the issues necessarily that violently of our children killing each other, we do deal with the issues of leaving our homes. We deal with the issues of our children not getting along. We deal with the issues about hoping to have grandchildren and maybe not getting them, but maybe getting them. We have to deal with issues of how do we stay together when we've had such great trauma. And these are the issues we face the world today still, although hopefully not nearly to that level where our children kill each other. But so that's one of my favorite ones. I don't know. I think we've all heard of it. The second one I wanted to speak about was the very first portion of Exodus, which obviously the book in Hebrew is called Shemot. And in English, that means names basically, but it's called Exodus. And this is the transition from this story of the prehistory of Judaism, this family that came from Adam and Eve, to the meat. And the meat of our book starts in Exodus. Genesis is the precursor. It's the prequel. It's the preparation for Exodus. It's how do we get into Egypt? And then all of a sudden in Exodus, we start off reminding ourselves about Joseph. And then we go straight into the story of the Hebrews that are slaves. That is the story from whence we came. That's how we became a large group of people. That's how we became a religion. We started from servitude, as so many religions often start at the bottom. And this is the transition from how we were a religion of a family to how we become a religion of a nation, and how we transform the world, and the difficulties we have in doing this. And so it's a real transition to go from, let's talk about this story of this one family, to all of a sudden, let's talk about the story of this entire people that are slaves. And we see that. And of course, the focus is on Moses, who is born in the 2nd chapter of Exodus. So we see how this savior person is going to be born, make a lot of mistakes, have a lot of issues, and yet overcome them to be our leader. So the first portion of Genesis and the first portion of Exodus are probably my favorite portions in those books. And there's so many characters and they're so vibrant, but of course the entire Torah is, obviously. And in terms of Moses, he becomes, of course, our greatest leader, but it starts off with a lot of his fallibility and the issues that we have as we leave. Even though he's trying to lead these people to freedom, they don't all necessarily want it. They're used to what they have. And this really sets the precedent for that. Of course, the plagues and the 10 Commandments and the crossing of the Red Sea, those are all awesome as well. But this was my favorite portion. Anybody else have any other portion in Exodus or Genesis that they really liked or that they grew up with? All right, so again, there's so many, but this one resonates with me. In Leviticus, which, as we know, is the 3rd book, and we'll go back to these portions again if we have some time, I chose a very particular one. I chose Bahalotecha because that was my bar mitzvah portion. And so I don't even think at the time I had my bar mitzvah, I knew the name of the portion. But luckily, I had a faint memory of what I read about. And so it wasn't that hard to find it, obviously, for today. So what is in Bahalotecha that I remember so well from my youth? And how many of us remember anything about our Torah portion when we were bar mitzvah, if we're a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah? So Larry remembers, Michael remembers, Jeff remembers. I don't know if Larry had his hand up. No, Larry did not. So Michael and Jeff. So my portion.
Get this, I'll have to go back to the VHS tape to see what I read.
That's right. I had mine right before mine was one of the last ones before they started recording them. So I don't have mine recorded. Thank goodness. But what is in this portion that I read when I was a kid? It's basically the construction of the tabernacle, talking about the trumpets, talking about the cloud and the fire. But the portion I read about was the rebellion against Moses by his sister and brother, which of course was Miriam and Aaron. So we don't remember always that Miriam and Aaron had a minor rebellion against Moses, basically saying, we're as good as you. You shouldn't have married this woman. We don't like your wife. And so we're going to rebel. And the rebellion is quick because it is God intervening right away and saying, what are you guys doing? And then God punishes Moses by basically giving her leprosy for a week. Aaron gets off scot-free because he must be the younger son who always gets off, like my brother always did. And we don't know exactly what this rebellion's about. Is it because of a power? Is it because it's a sibling spat? Is it because they didn't like his wife? Is it because they didn't like the religion of his wife? Are they just tired of hanging out? Remember, the two brothers and the sister have to hang out for 40 years straight, which is not always so easy. Think about living with your sibling for 40 years as an adult. That's not always so easy. So I got to talk about leprosy and how Miriam is punished. Plus, what is interesting is that both Aaron and Miriam seem to be culpable. They do the same thing, but only Miriam is punished. Why is Miriam punished as opposed to Aaron? Is he the cute younger brother? Was she doing something worse? Is this some sort of rally against women? Is it because Aaron's descendants are writing this story and they don't want him to be shown in a bad light? I don't remember all these issues, but I do remember my great aunt wrote my speech for me for my bar mitzvah. So she sent me this beautiful speech. And I was like, this is awesome. I don't have to write a speech. And of course, my parents were like, no, we're not going to use this. You still have to write your speech. So I thought I got out of it, but I didn't. My great aunt is still alive and living in Oklahoma. So I should call her and say thank you again. But Michael, what was your Torah portion for your bar mitzvah?
Well, mine was Bereshit. So you picked it. And I still remember the Haftorah a little bit, but you don't want to hear me chant it. And, I've often thought that I would like to do that, but then I know how I sing. And I don't
Anytime you want to chant at our synagogue, it does not matter. Everybody's welcome to chant.
I don't think I want to put something, but I also wanted to say, I know you're going to ask about other things in Vayikra and Leviticus, and my son's parsha I thought was a really good one, which seems maybe a little out of character for those who know me well, but it would be Kedoshim, and that's because there's one line in there which we talk about a lot, which is basically love thy neighbor as thyself, and that clearly resonates. And if you listen to some of the rabbis and philosophers, they say that's the essence of Torah. And in my mind, it would be nice if that were Torah with maybe a few more rules that are that have some contemporary meaning as opposed to others. But it's also it also shows the humanity of Judaism and the interpretation that is the essence of Torah. And the fact that some people say that that's the exact middle of the Torah, and I think most scholars, it's not, but depends how you count.
It's sort of the middle in terms of portions, but not in the middle in terms of length.
Yeah.
Some portions are longer than others.
So anyway, I think that, just that part of it just really resonates.
And that's the actual one I chose for Leviticus as well, which we'll get to in a bit. So great minds think alike, and so do us. Flossie.
I think the way you're asking the guys, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do they remember their Torah portion? I think you should go 1, 2, 3, and they all have to say it and have it blended together. It's not so much how they sound, but being impressed at this age, they can remember it.
I know, that's impressive. I think Jeff and then Larry. Jeff, you said you remembered yours.
Just a few lines.
Okay.
Not all of it, but if I see it, then the chant comes back. Yeah.
Do you know what it was about?
I gave a lecture on it, but I don't remember what the lecture was.
Well, if anybody has a VHS player, let me know so I can remember mine, please. If anyone has a VHS player, I'll be glad to remember.
That's a good point. You can take your VHS and put them on DVDs. And then, of course, DVDs don't work anymore either, so it doesn't matter. Larry.
Yeah, I don't remember my Torah portion, but I remember it was very rare that when I got my bar mitzvah, and for even some of my friends, that we even knew much of the Torah. The Torah portion was pretty much done by the elders of the synagogue, and it was the Haftorah that was.
Oh, really?
So that, the Haftorah was, where you got up and that you shined. That was your opportunity to deliver it.
Interesting.
So the Torah portion was kind of like, it was all done in Hebrew. There was no discussion of it. It didn't seem to me. I don't have vague memories. But the one thing that kindled, I did want to ask you was about, you mentioned leprosy and plagues. Plagues seem to play an important part of the Bible. You know, the plagues obviously in Egypt, and you know, God afflicting people with leprosy and how we treat lepers and things like that. I mean, are there things that, and I think people still believe today, there are some people still believe today that, you know, God's will, you know, he is determining and he's bringing COVID on us and things like this. Are there, you know, lessons that you think that are relevant from COVID that you can draw from some of the Bible stories?
Oh, very much so. I think, you know, the Bible is very, very good about teaching and preaching about how we deal with plagues. And I think leprosy is probably the best example. It's, you still treat people, whether they're sick or not, with respect and dignity. You don't risk your own health. You know, you don't necessarily go in the same room with someone who is, you think, contagious, but you do put them somewhere else. But that doesn't mean they're not a person anymore. You still treat them with respect. You still make sure they're fed and that they're clothed and they're taken care of. And then when they're healthy, they can come back. And if they're never healthy, then you still have the requirement of making sure they're taken care of. It's a very forward thinking way of doing things. But again, medical knowledge obviously back then was very limited, but they still had a sense of it. And so they understood if you're contagious, you stood away. They didn't know necessarily why. They understood that if you're contagious in one way, you might get over it and not be contagious again. If you were contagious in this other way, you might be contagious for life. They also knew which things were contagious and which weren't. So they could look at you, look at your skin, and generally say, this is not a contagious skin disease, or this one is. I just saw, we watched the internet, and I saw this this really article about a guy who does like the video assistant for a hockey team, and this woman is knocking on his glass case, and that happens all the time because fans want to be on the camera, and he just ignores her, and then she puts her phone to the case, and on it says, that mole on the back of your neck, I believe, is cancerous. Did you see that? And so he went and checked, and he turned out he had cancer, and this was a medical student who saved his life. So she just saw it and said, that is cancerous, or I think it is. And they had that ability as well to see and to know if it was a disease that was contagious or not. So the Bible is very specific about making sure you take care of yourself. Health is important. And obviously it doesn't go into medicine like we have, but it's a very modern, for its time, scientific type of literature. So I think a lot of it is very, and the plagues were really the blight on humanity because they didn't always understand they were coming from. You know, you had these plagues that could destroy your livelihood, which is so different than us. We have COVID, which is of course terrible. But for them, you know, a drought for 2 years in a row could just kill everybody. You know, the insects eating their food could determine whether they were going to have food for the year or not. So plague was a whole different level, maybe closer to like what polio was in the 50s. But really teaches that you still have to be human. You still have to help others in need. You still have to do all these things. Sorry, Larry.
I was just going to ask about, go back to leprosy for a minute, because, you know, that was so prominent in the Bible and in those days. But is there mention of leper colonies? And I mean, you mentioned that, you know, you're able to treat them and then if they, you know, return to society. But it just seemed, you know, some of it was brought on like pictures you see in Ben-Hur and those movies, right, you know, where you see these leper colonies where people kind of like, you know, house together in warehouses almost, you know, and you send them off to the leper colony and you forget about them.
There were leper colonies. They're not mentioned in that specific way, but it is mentioned that you do take care of these people, and then they have the opportunity, they may have the opportunity to come back, but they may not. So it's not as specific as Ben-Hur, but I think we all know they did have such colonies. Probably some of the people there did have leprosy. Leprosy wasn't as prevalent as we may think because there was a lot of skin diseases. So some people may have had it, some people may not have. But that's specifically why they tell this. They don't want to group everybody together and say you all have leprosy, you're contagious, you're going to die, just because you see a mole or just because you have a crusty piece of skin. They really wanted to check you out, put you in quarantine, and see if you really were sick. Whereas in other societies, you just were sent to the colony or you were just kicked out. And that's really the reason that's the reason it's stressed so much, because they really wanted to make sure that everybody did not have to go live in these terrible places if they didn't have to. All right, so those are good questions. All right, for Leviticus, I of course chose Michael's portion that he mentioned, which is Kiddushin. Actually, Leviticus obviously comes before Numbers because it is a really strange piece of Torah in the middle of this section that talks about, the priestly way that we kill animals and the sacrifice. All of a sudden you have this section which is just dealing with how to behave. It starts with basically the 10 commandments and then goes out other places and says, judge fairly. Don't do this, don't do this. It's all about ethics. Don't wrong someone who is there. Love someone as yourself. Don't bear a grudge. All these basic things that we now understand as what we would call the basis for modern morality is found in this section, which comes in the middle of nowhere. So it's called the Holiness Code, and Kedoshim obviously means holiness. And so it's all this whole section. It's kind of like Pirkei Avot in the Talmud. Pirkei Avot is those sayings from those rabbis all about how to behave. This comes out of nowhere. And then the last one I'm going to mention, and we'll go back for it, is the very last portion, Vizot HaTorah, which is the very last one in Deuteronomy. We actually never read it we don't read it on a Saturday. It's just read on Simchat Torah. It's the shortest portion in terms of words, although there's another portion that has less verses, but this is by far the shortest of the 54 Torah portions. And I like it because I like the conclusion where it says, never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, who God singled out face to face for the signs and portents that God sent him to display against Pharaoh in Egypt, and for all the awesome power that Moses displayed before Israel. And this is the end of the Torah. And basically it tells us you don't need to be Moses. I mean, it's a highlight that this was a very specific individual and that us today are not expected to be him. Maybe Sheila, but besides Sheila, we're not responsible to really help save the world. We're all human. We're supposed to do what we're supposed to do, as we read in the Holiness Code, but there's no describing how each of us has to save the world. And because if that is the case, then we're all going to feel really guilty because we don't. So it's basically saying this was a once in a lifetime person. I'm never sending another individual like him to really take over. It's your responsibility. Do what you can. And that I think is very powerful for everybody, because most of us do not change the world on this grand scale. We do what we're supposed to do. And that's really, I think, incredible.
There too.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful way to end it. Moses dies, and really he's got his kids, we don't know what happens to them. So it's not like this, Davidic dynasty. It's basically, I sent this one guy down for this one person, get you out of Egypt, spent 40 years creating the religion. Then he died, and now it's up to you guys, because I'm not going to give you a guy like this again. Some would say not until the Messiah, or not until Sheila, depending on how you read the translation. So, I like how it concludes the Torah with this very humbling experience for all of us, that even Moses dies, that even Moses fails, and he was the best of the best. So it's really, Larry.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you say, as we were talking about favorite portions, I was thinking of what is my least favorite portion.
Well, that's a good question. What's your least favorite portion?
Well, and I was thinking about the Moses story, and the way Moses kind of gets a raw deal. And I was always troubled by the explanations, that have been offered by that, the rock, the water, and did he disobey God? And, it just didn't seem, was he getting too old, and was somebody else going to have to take his place, which kind of like is the opposite of the argument that, he was one of a kind. He was the greatest. I'm not going to give you anybody else, but I'm going to bring you into the new land now with somebody who's inferior, who's not Moses. I can't give you the best, but I'll give you somebody, I'll give you Joshua, he'll have to take over for himself. But it just seemed to me that it's so troubling, the whole story of, the unfair. Of course, there's so much unfairness in the Bible anyway, but the Moses just gets a raw deal, not getting into the Holy Land.
Yeah, and that is from the book of Numbers. That's Chukat. And so that's, again, the great question is, why does Moses not get in? And it doesn't really define it. A lot of people say because he hit the rock, because that's what immediately happens before the punishment. But for all we know, there was something in there that wasn't written down. But I continue to think that the reason was because they didn't want this icon leading the people anymore. They wanted the people to lead the people. But you're right. He does get, spends 40 years and he doesn't get his goal. But you're also right that the Bible is a very, in many ways, realistic book, especially compared to other books of the time, because regular bad things happen to people and they show the worst things happening. Whereas in the other books, you talk about heroes and gods, and, even today, there's always a happy ending. In the Bible, there's not always a happy ending. And you have to kind of deal with it in the best way possible, which is probably one of the main reasons it's still around today.
Do you have a portion that is the most troubling, or the one that you've struggled with the most? And, and even in rabbinical school, I imagine, you discuss these with the other rabbinical students and you go back and forth. Was there something that, stood out from your experience in rabbinical school as the most difficult to try and explain to the congregation?
Yeah, I think it has to always be Vayera. That is just such a difficult portion. I know I'm going back and preaching to the choir, but that's the most famous difficult one. But it's really hard to pick anything else. I mean, especially now that I have children, the idea of God giving me the choice of loving God or killing my children and not being able to do both is a really problematic one for me, and I think for everybody. Even before I had children, I think it would have still been that one. And I think Michael brought that up earlier. Flossie.
Does it say how Moses felt that he couldn't get into the promised land?
Oh, yeah. He is very upset. He is not a happy camper. He is really upset. He thinks it's unfair. He spends a lot of the book of Deuteronomy explaining how unfair it is, or at least hinting at it. I think he has a little bit of a temper. He's lost a little bit of he's still very strong. He still has his health, but he's kind of not as patient, I think, as he was. He's learned to be a little bit more patient. He wasn't patient in the first place, but he got better. And I think he kind of lets go and just, he lashes out a bit. And it shows that even a leader as great as Moses, when he gets bad news like this, he's not like, oh, well, I did my best. He's like, wait a minute, this is unfair. Flossie.
Were there people when this was decided who protested it, who didn't like God's decision?
That is a good question. They do not really show that very much. That's a good question. Did the people want him to stay as the leader? It's hard to say. I mean, no matter how great a leader you are, 40 years is a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a reason why the president can only be president for 2 terms. So I think the feeling you get is this is a new generation. Moses was their father and grandfather's leader. He's still the leader, but I think they're probably ready for someone from their generation to take over. Although funny enough, it isn't somebody from their generation, because the next guy is just as old as Moses, almost, or not just as old, but he's not a young guy, and Joshua. So I think we all know that not a dictator, but in many ways a dictator, it's a long time to rule 40 years and do it well. And there's got to be a time where you step down. And many a leader decides to step down too late. And Moses did not. Moses stepped down and he was still revered. If he had waited another 10 years, who knows if he would have still been revered, or if he would have become, the villain almost.
What happens to Joshua actually after, he goes to Israel and the Battle of Jericho, and, he becomes the hero and things like that? He kind of disappears. We don't really hear about, does his line get any kind of rewards, or his
It
family?
does not. Well, I think you have to understand that he is under the same venue in many ways as Moses. He is a particular hero for a particular moment in time. He is there for the entry to be, in many cases, a military leader. And so he dies, he's over 100 when he dies. He dies towards the end, but not at the end of the book. And so, he is kind of like almost the continuation of Moses before we go into our tribal time. So you got to remember, Moses is leading a group of people that are not one nation. They are a group of tribes. Joshua is leading a group of tribes together for the sole purpose of moving into Israel. When they get into Israel, they all then want to live in their tribes. And so it's really more of a confederation than a federation. So he's there to continue Moses's lead, to lead them to military victories, to settle the land. And then everybody's going to kind of go into their own tribal leadership until the time of the kings. So, he died, he's over 100 years old when he dies, but his purpose, and he does succeed. So he succeeded just like Moses did in what he was supposed to do. But he is not meant to be someone whose son becomes the next leader and whose grandson and so on. He's very much in the same vein as Moses, a one-time leader. Flossie.
Did people intermarry with each other, different tribes, or once you were in a tribe, that was it for life?
No, that's a great question. And often they did, but people did intermarry, not religiously, but to people of the tribe. It was probably fairly common. That is why there are very specific rules of transition or of where land goes to. So your land cannot leave your tribe, basically. So, and they have a very specific case that is essential, that is in the Torah, about a group of women who have no brothers and they inherit their father's land. But it very specifically says, if you marry somebody outside the tribe, the land stays with the tribe. So yes, people were probably moving pretty often from one place to another, distant cousins, but the land had to stay with the tribe. So, and again, the tribal times is kind of a time where we have to realize it's not working. The tribal time is like, it's not working. We need to have a unified group of people, but we're going to have to do the tribes first. Remember, when they're in the desert, when they're in Egypt, your tribe is your family. I mean, that is your group. This other group are slaves, you're connected, but it is like, distant connections. So Moses, it's through the strength of Moses that he holds this group together, kind of like
I'll take a minute.
World War II, all of the allies are grouped together for one purpose alone. And this is what they are. They're there for one purpose alone, to leave Egypt, form a religion, take the land, and then we can go live in our families again. But it becomes united. It's not for hundreds of years later till we become a united religion. All right, Larry, and we'll do this the last one, then we'll go over what's coming up next.
I was just going to move a little bit outside of the 5 books and go into other parts. And the story that I'm always intrigued by is when Samuel is asked to appoint the first king, right? And that part, I think, is really interesting, where, the people are demanding a king, and, God says not a good idea, and or Samuel doesn't really want to do it, but, we don't need this autocracy. And it kind of took a couple of 1,000 years, for the French Revolution, or I guess King Charles in England was the first one that was, Macbeth kind of kings were always assassinated. But I mean, the first one we know historically, I think, was 1640s with King Charles in England. But, with this autocracy and, how people want this kind of an autocratic, and we see this again. I just said it on a lecture talk yesterday that was done by Jewish Museum in Poland, and they were talking about some very scary things that are taking place right now in Poland with the laws there against journalists, historians, basically, and they want to rewrite history, and it's just extremely scary as far as what's happened in Poland and Hungary in particular, with this revisionist kind of thing of, well, you never know the truth, so that the Holocaust may be true, it may not be true, but if you write against it, you can be sued. It's almost a crazy thing, and this whole business was just, people want a strong leader, it seems like, in many of these places, and it's a warning against this autocracy. So that part always resonated with me, that, and I know a lot of the world loves strong leaders.
Yeah, and again, that's one of the things that this rallies against, is continually the strong leaders. That's why they don't want to repeat of Moses or Joshua. But yeah, we could talk about that another time. It's a really, the beginning of the kingly system. We have, for next week, all we have is something called kosher Torah, which I think is talking about the writing of an actual Torah. We can change that if we want to talk about the book of Samuel, or the 2 books of Samuel, which is really interesting. We were there going to talk about the Slani Torah history when we went to Paul and Eva's house, but we'll probably have to debate that to see if we're going to still do it, depending on COVID, in a couple of weeks. But if people want, instead of talking about why a Torah is kosher, we can talk about the books of Samuel, which are really interesting and not spoken about as much. What would you guys like to do for next week?
Can we combine it?
We can. We can talk about how a Torah is made kosher. Jonathan wanted to know if we did Jews in sports, which we did already, but I'm happy to do again as well. There's so many of them. I'm just finding out all these. I'm just reading an article about Tom Oker, who was a tennis player. I didn't even realize he was Jewish. Do we want to do the book of Samuel though next week, the 2 books of Samuel, and talk about kosher Torah?
Yeah. Could we also, in the future, maybe do a little bit about what's happening in some of the Eastern European countries now? With the current events. It just it was mind blowing and scary as far as some of the laws that are taking place in some of these countries that are aimed against not only immigrants but the Jews, and anti-Semitism. And I know the JCC had a speaker a couple of years ago. The JEA rather had a speaker a couple of years ago from Poland, and he was talking about revival of the Jewish, Jewish families in Poland. But it seems like things are with the new government there,
and I wouldn't say it's new, but it's in the past 5-6 years taking place.
Yeah, I mean, we could do that. I think that's a good one. We could take that. I'm sorry, Steve.
Right.
Huh?
What is it? Oh, it's Wednesday.
Somebody was saying something.
That was Flo just saying hello. She's shopping.
Oh, hey, Flo.
Next time I tune in, everybody needs to come to Haversham Beverage. We'll have the learning session then.
Well, that would be a much more interesting learning session. I can guarantee it. And this class, by the way, was sponsored by Haversham Beverage, where you can get all of your beverages that you need to study with. And so thank you. So if you guys don't mind, we'll do the book of Samuel next week, and then we can talk about issues in the Jewish world today. And as we know, the world leans back and forth from wanting, strong leaders to more democratic ideals. And we go back and forth, unfortunately, too often for my case. Flossie.
Who is the figure behind you?
That's Groucho Marx.
I said that.
That's right.
Okay, that's what
Yeah, sometimes I have Darth Vader on the other side, but I moved him.
I was looking. I said to Jeff, that's Groucho. Okay.
Yeah. I have, my mom collected dolls. She had like over 1,000 dolls and stuffed animals, and I kept a few of them. My wife tells me that when she first came over to my house, when we just started dating, and she saw my house was very neat and nice, and all of a sudden she went into this room and I had all these dolls on the wall. She said, "Oh my gosh, he's going to kill me." The lunatic. Larry, we'll finish with you.
Yeah, you had mentioned the Jews in sports, and I know we did this, but before we left New Jersey, they had a sale at the library, and I'm always browsing books for 50 cents and $1, and I picked up a book on the origin of the Maccabean Games. Oh,
that'd be great. That's a great idea.
And it's really interesting. I mean, many countries have, international games and things like that, the British Empire games and stuff like that. But the Maccabean Games, the way that originated is kind of interesting, and, how it's evolved. And I've just gotten started in reading the book there.
That's a great idea. Let's do that in February. That is a really good one, I think, because, if you go to any Wikipedia site for any Jewish athlete, it usually says won or competed in the Maccabi Games. It's like one of the things, like won a Grand Slam, did this, and then won 2 gold medals in the Maccabi Games. And a lot of us know, I have a friend of mine whose brother played tennis, and he went to the actual Maccabi Games in Israel, and he was so excited because he played Shlomo Glickstein, the number 1 Israeli tennis player in the world at the time, first round. I think he lost 6-0, 6-0 or 6-0, 6-1. He was just excited that he got to play this professional tennis player who was probably ranked in the top 30 at the time. So yeah, I think that's great, because we could talk about the actual Maccabi Games in Israel, and then we could talk about all the youth Maccabi Games that are now all around the world. That's a good idea. That's great. And we can bring in sports into that as well. All right, fantastic. So right now we are scheduled to meet in person in 2 weeks. I'm going to table that for a week to see how things are going. If it doesn't work out, we may just do that one virtually, if that's okay, because of what's going on. But thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you, everybody who's joining us on YouTube. We still have some people left. Some people have left off, but I want everybody to say goodbye as we're now on community view, or what do they call it? Gallery view. So thank you. Such a pleasure. Nice picture, Baba. And you guys have a great week, and thanks for everything, and great discussion as always.
Thank you.
All right. Stay safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.